In the last video, we talked all about recursion and other types of loops, and now in this video, we're going to talk about short-circuit evaluation, which is a really important topic inside of JavaScript. So if you remember properly, when you were comparing different Boolean values, you could use this double pipe symbol for OR operations and the double ampersand symbol in order to do AND concatenations. And something really interesting about these operations is that if you were to have here, for example, true or true, or false, this essentially is saying if this is true, or if this is true, or if this is true, then everything is going to be true. And JavaScript is smart enough to know that if you have true or true, we'll even get rid of this end part. If you have true here inside of an or statement, automatically it knows no matter what this is, if this is false or if this is true, it's going to return true no matter what. So JavaScript is smart enough to say, okay, well, this is true, and I know I'm doing an or operation, so I don't care what this other value is because it's always going to return true overall. So what it does is it'll execute this, and if this is true, it just ignores everything else that comes afterwards, and it doesn't actually evaluate that. This is what's called short-circuit evaluation. It is short-circuiting out of this equation because it knows the end result no matter what this value is over here. So let's just take a quick look at an example of that. We'll say console.log of true or true. You'll see this returns true. If I change this to false, it'll still return true because JavaScript knows that as long as this is true, it doesn't matter what the second portion is. So let's create really quick a couple functions. We'll call this one print and print hi true. This is just going to console.log hi, and then it's going to return true. And then we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to call this one print hi false, and it's just going to return false, just like this. And actually, let's just call this print true, and we're going to make this one false. And we'll get rid of the hi from here, just so it's a little bit more clear exactly what's going on. So we can get that done just like that. So now what we can do instead of here is replace this with print true or print false. And since this is returning true, that's the same exact thing as having true being here directly. I'm just doing it this way so that we can actually print things out to see what happens. And now we don't need this external console log. So now if we run this, you can see it prints out just the text true. It doesn't actually print the text false. And that's again because of that short circuit evaluation. What's happening is it runs print true, it logs out true, and then this returns true. So it says true or anything is always true. So we're just not going to run this. It's as if this doesn't even exist at all. That's what short circuit evaluation does. If this was flipped and this said print false and this said print true, well, it's going to print out false and true. The reason for that is because this returns false down here. So this is saying false or, and JavaScript knows that false or true is true and false or false is false. So it doesn't know what the end result is going to be yet. It depends on what the second value is. So it has to run that second value. The same exact thing happens if we use and. So if we come in here, we say and, we know that false and anything at all, this could be true or this could be false. It doesn't matter. False and anything is always going to be false. So now if we run this, you'll see only false gets printed because once this is false, JavaScript immediately knows it doesn't matter what this second half is. It's always going to result in false overall. So just skips running that second half completely. So that's kind of interesting to know, and it's kind of cool, but I mean, why is this even useful? Well, there's two specific scenarios where you're going to use each of these. First, I'm going to talk about when you would use the OR version of the short circuiting. Let's say that we have a function that's going to say, this is just print name, and it takes in a name, and it's going to just console.log out the name. And now let's say that we wanted to say, if the name is equal to null, then instead what I want to do is I want to change the name to be equal to, we'll just say default. I'm just going to put this on a different line to make it easier to read. So now we're just giving this name a default value if it's null, if we don't actually pass a name. So if we call print name and we give it a name of Kyle, for example, it's going to print Kyle. But if we don't pass in a name, it's just going to print out that default value that we've defined. This is a pretty common use case, something that you're going to see all the time. You need to define a default value for a variable. Well, in JavaScript, we can actually make this a little bit easier. Instead of using this if check here, instead what we can do is we can just say name is going to be equal to name or default. Let's make this capital. Default. There we go. This does the exact same thing as this if check, because if name is false, and we know that null is a false value, then it's going to fall back to this default. But if name is true, it's not actually going to execute anything after this. It's as if this didn't even exist. While if name is false, it knows it has to go and execute this next section. So if we save, we get default being printed. And if we pass in a name, it's going to print out the name. This is a really great way to create default values, because if this is ever a false value, for example, 0, an empty string, null, undefined, the actual false itself, then it's going to say, well, I have to continue executing and I'll return this instead. You're going to see this all the time. We could even just put this inside of our console log here instead. And again, it's going to work just the same as before. If we just get rid of this, you'll see it now prints out that default value. So this is one way that you're going to see yourself using the OR. It's really great for defining default values. Now the next way is when you use an AND. And AND is really good for if you want to do really simple if checks without actually doing all of the if stuff inside of it. So let's just say here we have const person, and person has an address, and the address has a street, and we'll just say main street, for example. So this is our person object. Let's even give him a name. We'll just say Kyle. There we go. So normally when you would access this person, you would just say console.log person.address.street. We save and it prints out their street. What happens if for some reason this person doesn't actually have an address? It's just null for some reason. Now when we save this, we're going to get an error. And this error, if we go over here, it just says cannot read property street if undefined, because there is no address on this user. The address is undefined. So what you need to do is you essentially need to say, well, if person.address, then what we can do is the code inside of here. So we'll say if this is not equal to null, then we can console.log person.address.street. And now we get rid of this code down here, and we go to our console and run this, you'll see it doesn't actually print anything because there is no address for us to print out. Now, what happens if person is actually null? So now we have just a null person here. You can see, whoops, if I set this to null, you can see we again get an error because it cannot read the property address of null because there is no thing on person. So now we need another if check inside of here. So we can just say if person is not equal to null, and if the person address is not equal to null, then we can print everything out. And now you'll see it doesn't print anything out and we don't get any errors. But if we have a full person that has an address and a street, and the street, for example, is main street, you'll see that prints out properly. This is kind of bulky code. It's a lot of code to write in order to make sure this works. So instead, what you can do is you can use the AND symbols in order to concatenate these all together. So we can say person and person.address and person.address.street. And we can put that all inside of our console log. And that's going to do the exact same thing. See, it prints out our street properly. And if we don't have an address, for example, it's going to just print out undefined. And if we don't even have a person, if person is null, it still prints out, well, in our case, null, but if we change this to undefined, it would print out undefined. And the reason that this works like it does is because what we're doing is we're checking to see, is person true? In our case, it's not because it's undefined, but let's just say that it was. It was an object that had nothing inside of it. So now person is true. Okay, we go on to the next one. Now we say is person.address true? Well, there is no address, so this is false. And it short circuits. It doesn't run this code after the AND. And that's great because there is no street on the address because there is no address. So we avoid all those errors. So essentially, if you need to deeply access a property inside of an object, and you don't know if it's going to exist or not, separating them by these AND symbols is a great way to do that, and something that you'll see all the time inside of JavaScript code. Because essentially all these AND symbols do is say, is person true? If so, continue. If it's false, exit immediately and don't execute anything else, which is great because if person is not true, then that means that there's no address on it because person is not an object. It's null, undefined, false, something else. Same thing with this. Is person.address a true value and does it exist? If it exists, then hey, we can access the street on it. If not, just exit immediately and don't continue. And that's all there is to this short circuit evaluation. These are really the two use cases that you're going to see this in. It's going to be either default values or checking to see if properties on objects exist. You're pretty much not going to see this anywhere else. Now in the next video, we're finally going to move on and actually go into building a project. And this project is going to be building out a keyboard inside of JavaScript. It's super fun and I can't wait to see you in that video.